Alright, so there's a new season of The Deadliest Warrior, and things are a lot different now. It's still very recognizably the same show, and I'll explain how in a second, but things have changed. For instance, they have gotten rid of at least one of the characters, maybe even two. I can't exactly remember who they got rid of. The main guy is still there, the main guy being, I used to call him Meathead. The guy who's apparently like a doctorate. He's apparently like got all these degrees and stuff like that. He's apparently really smart. He doesn't look smart. He looks like a fucking jock. Because he's always the guy they cut to. Meathead's always the guy they cut to whenever something really gory happens, and he goes, "Oh!" He always loves being the guy to yell, "Fire! Oh!" But yeah, he's always that guy who's in it for the gore. All he ever wants to talk about is damage. Like, how much damage did it do? How much blood is there? Like, how bad would this fuck you up? Basically, in those exact words, he's like, the guy'd be talking like, well, Napoleon brings a 8-pound cannon, and you can load grape shot in this. And he's like, and basically his reaction to all this is like, you're throwing these technical terms at me, grape shot. How bad does grape shot fuck you up? And the guy's like, well, I'll show you. And so he fires the cannon, and it fucks guys up. And he's like, oh, it fucked a lot of people up. This is the better one. So, like I said, this Deadliest Warrior pitted George Washington against Napoleon. And this, ironically enough, is one of the less ridiculous matchups, as in, these guys generally come from very similar historical eras, in the sense that their fighting styles, or generally their fighting styles in that time were the same, and the weapons were roughly in the same kind of tier. And these are cultures that actually might have had contact, or they did have contact. So geographically speaking, these weren't two very disparate cultures, and it was a more plausible pairing than you might think. But here's where the show, and I'm probably going to repeat myself from previous times, but the show is not scientific at all. It's just not. Not in the slightest. It's really funny in that the primary focus of this show still seems to be comparison of the weapons and the methodology in those comparisons, where they determine what weapon is better. So, and here even, it seemed to be really confused as to whether or not they wanted to compare an army led by George Washington versus an army led by Napoleon, or just Napoleon versus George Washington. And by that I mean, they compared weapons that, they sometimes compared weapons that the army might have wielded, and sometimes they compared weapons that the general might have wielded. For instance, they chose the French cavalry saber for Napoleon, who might have ridden around on horseback and swung at people, and the cavalry might have had the French cavalry saber, of course. But then they went with George Washington's sword. I forget its name. It's like the cauchemar or something like that. It's like it's a stabbing weapon. It's a thrusting weapon, and they claimed, I have no idea to verify. If I looked on Wikipedia, I could probably find answers or something like that. But they said the design of this weapon was actually designed to counter the swinging tactics of a saber. But they also ignored a great number of things. Okay, let's just take the swords for instance. Washington might have had this sword, but when you're dealing with close quarters combat, aren't you really talking about bayonets? Because that's what the armies might have had. And in fact, that would have made a not very interesting show, because I'm guessing both sides had bayonets on the end of their rifles, or muskets. But it was a little disconcerting actually to see. It was hard to tell, because they would compare cannons, they would compare rifles, and they would compare muskets, and then they just went to, well, if Napoleon and Washington just threw down in a street fight, with their swords who would win. I don't know. So the methodology is what really bothers me every single time about this show. And it's no more maddening than it was here. For instance, let's just go with the cannons. They're like, okay, what cannon is better? So you had Napoleon's 8-pound cannon versus Washington's 6-pound cannons. And already Meathead was like, well, 8 is bigger than 6, so that's gotta be better, right? How bad does it fuck you up? And so they go, okay, well, we're gonna set up this little simulation where we have these guys, and they're gonna fire the cannons at this recreation of a little outpost. So they build a red house, and they put these little dummies out in front of the house with a cannon, and they're like, okay, there's 3 guys manning this cannon that's outside the house, and inside the house it's an officer's quarters, and there's 4 officers inside the quarters. So what you're going to do is you're going to get 5 shots, and you get to fire your 5 shots at anything you want. Your primary objective is the cannon, but we're going to count all the guys you hit, and whoever gets the most, that's the better gun. And already, I got a big problem with this, because there's so much more to this, and what's funny is they actually mention these other factors and then completely fail to take them into account in their testing. Probably because they can't, but they mention these things, but then they don't do anything about it. For example, Napoleon's 8-pound cannon is historically made of like iron, and the 6-pound cannon that Washington used, historically speaking, was made of bronze. And right away, there's a very fundamental difference there. Yes, the 8-pound cannon was probably more devastating, especially when fired in a barrage with many other cannons. It had much more penetrating power, accuracy. I can't argue accuracy one way or the other, and I'll tell you why in a second. But the 8-pound cannon, it's going to hit harder. It's going to do more damage, more like than not. But you also have to consider the bronze manufacture of the American cannon, which was actually which illustrates part of the American ingenuity back then, and also their lack of resources. It's a good and a bad thing, and that the bronze cannons were actually it's actually something of a bit of I'm not sure how much legend this really is, but they were made of bronze for several reasons. They used to melt down bells, statues, candlesticks, and all that stuff to get the raw materials to make these bronze, because the Americans were all scrappy and they had to improvise their weapons. And so that's one reason they were made of bronze. The other reason is that bronze cannons, and many armies did this in response to the very heavy iron cannons that the French used. They used these bronze cannons because bronze is lighter. It's much lighter. And there's also arguments to be said for the longevity and the durability of one cannon versus the other. But it was so much lighter, it made the army more mobile and more adaptable. And more, they could maybe deploy faster, redeploy more rapidly, sight in differently. So they actually mention this. They go, well, these are made of completely different materials, and the bronze cannon is much lighter, and they could redeploy faster. But let's just see which one fucks more people up. And so then they just go shoot anyway. So they set up these 2 static targets, and they go shooting. And this is again. I always hate when they do this, and they do this every fucking time with every fucking weapon, especially the guns or any kind of ranged weapon. They set these 2 crews up, they fire at these targets, they count out the number of targets that were killed, and then they go, well, this one's clearly better. Which is such a logical fallacy. I can't even, I'll try to describe it to you, but I don't even know where to start with this. Let's just start with the pure fact that we are taking these cannons out of their elements. We're expecting them to fire with precision at targets, when cannons were largely meant to be fired in a barrage at a large group of targets where your accuracy is not all that important as long as you're killing people. So you're firing it at an army. You're firing it at a charging horde. Are you really aiming for one target in particular? Probably not. Now, I know the French. I know every cannon brigade, or every cannoneer kind of prided themselves on accuracy, and I'm sure that accuracy was a great factor when you were targeting someone in particular, or at least one unit in particular, over a very long range. And that's the key: is they didn't fire those cannons at any appreciable range. They didn't fire the cannons at a large mass of targets, at least not until I'll get to this. But it's kind of an indiscriminate weapon, is my point. Is when you're firing a cannon, you're just trying to kill people, and that's kind of the point. Is the cannonball would blow through a line and then bounce and then keep killing people. You're not just aiming at a guy. You're not aiming at a cannon. You're aiming at a line of cannons. It doesn't matter which cannon, as long as you're hitting something when you're aiming. And I guess that's my point with this is, they got these 3 guys on the hill, and they're like, fire this cannon at those 3 guys. Now, experienced cannon operators could probably do this, which leads me to my second point. You are expecting these guys, these crews, they have this French crew and they have an American crew, and now I concede that of anyone they could have chosen, allegedly these guys are experts who have studied how to do these things. So they know how to load these cannon. They have the equipment to do this. They don't manage to blow their own faces off. And of anybody you could have picked, you probably would want to pick these guys because they're knowledgeable about it. However, these guys are not battle-trained cannon crews who have any kind of real-world experience, who have spent nearly as much time training with these things as the real-life counterparts would. Now, again, that's a problem I don't know how to solve in the context of this show, but still, you're expecting these guys who are kind of weekend warriors at best to be able to pull off essentially trick shots with weapons that are not meant to be nearly this accurate. So, could a real-life French cannon crew from Napoleon's era pull off these shots? Yeah, probably. Could guys in Washington today have deployed and shot at an officer's quarters? Yeah, probably. But that's neither here nor there. And so we are essentially putting up the superiority of one weapon or the other in the hands of who kills more dummies that are standing perfectly still, fired by guys who are not trained in this. Not really. Which is exactly not the way you want to determine which weapon is better. It'd be like me taking an M16 and going up against a Navy SEAL who is armed with, a 9mm handgun, and then taking us out to the range and saying, you have 5 shots, whoever hits the most targets has the better weapon. And so the Navy SEAL, of course, hits all 5 targets, and I've never fired a real fucking M16 in my life. I nearly dislocate my shoulder firing the fucking thing. I hit nothing, and so they go, well, clearly the 9mm is better. And even then, I would argue that it's such a... both weapons have their own utility. There's times when you would want one weapon or the other, and so, God, the testing methodology bugs the shit out of me. The one concession they did give to the cannons was then they loaded grape shot into the French cannon, and then the American equivalent, I think they called it scatter shot, but they essentially loaded shotgun ammo in these cannons, and then they put forward this massed group of targets in front of each cannon, and then they fired it, and then they go, well, the French one lethally injured 8 targets, and the American scattershot took out 6, and so this one is better. And that was, ironically enough, probably the most accurate test they did the whole fucking time. Was they kind of set up the cannons in identical circumstances, and then fired them at identical sets of targets, and then picked a winner based on the empirical level of devastation that was measurable on both sets of targets. I was like, oh my god, this still is scientifically just brutal, but it's still there's still way fewer variables than there were in the last one where you were firing at a fucking hut from 50 yards away with a cannon, and oh god. The second test was the muskets that they had. So they had the French muskets versus the American muskets, and they had a long rifle, like I think it was called like a Springfield long rifle. And then they had 4 targets lined up, and they had a little officer on a fake horse on a track that was going back and forth. And they're like, okay, everyone has 5 shots. We're going to time you guys, and after everyone's fired their 5 shots, we're going to count up how many guys are dead, and then that weapon is better. So of course, the French guys fire at the targets. They spend like 2 minutes. They spend more like 4 minutes, and then everyone's fired 5 shots, and the 4 footmen are down, but the moving target is still standing, and they go, oh, I don't know about this. So they get the American guys lined up, and the Americans, they fire all their shots, and of course, they all die. They get them all, and so they go, well, 5 targets, the American weapons are better. Once again, we are ignoring several aspects of not only talking the training with the weapons, which I'm guessing these guys have rarely, if ever, fired either one of these weapons, and are guessing at best on the behavior of these guns. They have no experience with these weapons. I'm sure they've loaded them and maybe popped one off at a target once or twice in their lives, but I highly doubt these guys have the practice of field-trained veterans. And further, we are ignoring, once again, the circumstances in which these weapons were used. Now, they did say, like, they said, these muskets were intended for volley fire, in which case you have, about 100 guys in a line firing at 100 guys across a field, which is what volley fire is intended to be. So they're like, well, to simulate that, we have these 4 guys. And so they line up 4 guys. That's not volley fire, that's 4 assholes shooting at 4 dummies. Once again, and they bring this up when they're talking about the weapon. They go, now these weapons were not at all accurate. The fitting, that you just basically threw a loose fitting ball inside the musket and fired it off, and God knows where it goes. You're essentially picking a direction and going. And so these weapons are intended for shooting in the vague direction of a large mass group of soldiers, and you're not really picking one out. You're just hoping somebody dies, So when you got 100 motherfuckers with muskets shooting at a large group of enemies, somebody's dying. You're not maybe hitting the guy you intended, but somebody's fucking dying. Now, again, and here's where I would also argue the accuracy with... I have actually seen musket fire that is shockingly accurate, and if you've got guys who actually know what they're doing, this test might have been over in 1 volley. I don't know. But that, again, you're leaving the superiority of the weapon in the hands of just guys, which is not what you want to do. You need to reduce variables, people. This is not the scientific method. Which leads me to, they talk about the sabers. They test the French saber and the stabby weapon that Washington had. Same thing. They have the guys run around and hit posts with pork tied around them, and then they still have the most worthless character in the show. I have no idea why this guy is here. Dr. Dorian. Okay, for instance, they're shooting at the moving horsemen with their muskets, and so the American guy with the long rifle hits the horseman and blows it in half. Because these dummies are... What's really funny is these dummies are basically plaster that are filled with these enormous plastic bags of fake blood. So whenever the dummies get hit, it punches a hole in the plaster, and then this Japanese Tokyo Gore Police level of blood fountains out of the fucking dummy. It's like, seriously, like 18 gallons of fake blood just start coursing out of the fucking dummy, and every time somebody gets shot. And so they even throw like bones in there. I think they have like either simulation rib cages or, God help us, real rib cages inside these things. And so when the dummy explodes, you see this gore and like fucking sausage flops out and ground beef and it's like the fucking Tropicana wave of just... So, and they do this so the meathead guy can see the gore fly out, and he goes, "Oh! Oh my God!" I love watching this show because the guy is so easily amused by this shit. He's, "Oh! Look at the blood!" So this fucking guy, Dr. Dorian, they blow the fucking dummy in half just because you're shooting a plaster mannequin with a rifle. The thing flops in half. This geyser of blood flops up, and the guy goes. He walks up to this dummy and goes, "Well, he's dead." And then he goes, "Of course, human tissue wouldn't fall apart like this." But I'm certain he would have died. God. They go to, and every time somebody gets shot, he has to go up to every single dummy, point to the wound, and go, "This is a whatever the name of the Latin name of the cheekbone is." He goes, "This is a fracture of the thingamma." He goes, "This is an instant kill." And then he walks up and he goes, "Oh, shot right to the rib cage, right over this rib here," and he goes, "That would have killed you." And then he walks up to this guy and he goes, "Stabbing wound right to the solar plexus. That probably would have killed you in about a minute." And then he goes up to the guy who's been his balls are shot off, like one of the musketeers shot him in the balls, and he goes, "Well, this probably would have killed you just from blood loss in about 5 minutes." And he goes to the sword. He walks up to like a fucking hacked up piece of pork, and he goes, "Look at the depth of this wound. This definitely would have killed you." That's all he says. That's all he ever fucking says. Like it's a surprise. You know, it's a surprise that a musket wound to the fucking face would kill you. Like it's a surprise that getting hacked in the gut with a fucking French cavalry saber would probably end up killing you. And he really does act surprised. He goes, "Ooh." He goes, "This is a deep laceration of the muscle tissue. Yeah, that would kill you. It certainly would take you out of the fight." Sometimes he'll go up to these mannequins and go, "Oh, he's been shot in the hand. This probably wouldn't kill you. So this weapon's better." Do you see what I'm talking about? Like they take the accuracy of the man firing the weapon and then use it to judge the goodness of the weapon. Ignoring the versatility, the utility, God damn it. But yeah, Dr. Dorian is still around. I don't know why, but who's definitely not around, is the guy who, Max Geiger. I fucking remember his name. I can't believe I do. My memory is so bad, but I remember Max fucking Geiger. He's not there anymore because they're not using the much-touted simulation software from Slytherin Studios. No, they have a new guy who has a new piece of software, and it's better. They even say it's better because it takes into account more stuff. It simulates the shit more times, and it takes into account X factors. What are the X factors? Well, I'm glad you asked, because this is where the show is different. Over the course of the show, either because... I really puzzle over the motivation why this changed. I don't know if it's because they could no longer deny... Like, when you're talking about Washington and Napoleon, you can't talk about these guys without talking about their generalship, their leadership capabilities, the environment in which they fought in, and the resources they had to deal with, and the relative size of their armies. You can't talk about these two as if you're talking about fucking Rashad Evans pairing up with another, like, light heavyweight in a fight. You know, you can't do a tale of the tape. They do! They do. They actually give, they go, "Oh, George Washington, well, he was 6'2", 200 pounds, and Napoleon was 5'6", 140 pounds. Right there, I got a problem with this matchup. Because you've got guys who are dealing with they're dealing with unique health issues, each one of them. But you're also dealing with a guy who's outweighed by 60 pounds in a sword fight. And who's got almost a half foot of... he's got 8 inches of height on the guy. So he's a head higher, and he outweighs the motherfucker. So, like, you can imagine Washington just overbearing fucking Napoleon. Especially after Napoleon, as we've seen, is a big fan of the Ziggy Piggy. The dude liked his La Glace. So, I'm just saying, the guy had an ulcer. I think Washington dealt with malaria over the course of his life. I don't know, but these guys have their own health issues, but they did a tale of the tape. But they eventually had to talk about the generalship of both these guys. And I'm still struggling with why. Because they really seem to hate it. They seemed to hate talking about it. And I don't know if it's because they just had to. Like if it's, like they go, Washington, Napoleon, have to talk about this. I don't know if it's because there's actually reason starting to creep into the show. Like they go, my God, what are we doing? We have to talk about at some point the terrain, the leadership. Or I don't know if it's because we're dragging them kicking and screaming into some kind of scientific or at least contextual accuracy with these discussions. Because they hate it. You can tell they hate talking about this. This show is so about the visual, visceral nature. All the meathead guy wants to see, all he wants to talk about is carnage. He wants to have shit blow up. He wants to have fucking horrible chest wounds. He wants to have Dr. Dorian point at these 12-inch fucking lacerations that are seeping gore and go, that guy's dead. That guy's fucking dead. He wants something concrete to point at and go like, see that? That guy's, his fucking ribs are caved and he's fucking dead. Like, they want that to point at. So when they actually start talking about the qualities of leadership, they have to intercut it with stock footage. They have to. They have all this recreation footage of Napoleon, like riding over a hill with a saber raised. They have to have this footage of cannons firing and people dying and exploding and fucking Russians getting blown apart by Bonaparte and Washington plotting battle strategy. Like, even the stuff where they're talking about how smart these guys are, they have this recreation footage of Washington sitting at a table with like a glass of brandy and like looking over a map and like, here we have to blockade them at the Chesapeake Bay here and shit. So what the fuck was I? Oh, and so they have to make it as visual as possible. So instead of just doing what I would have done, which is if you were giving me this task of like, okay, Noah, you got to make this show where you have to pick who wins, Napoleon versus Washington, and I go, okay, well, there's a lot of factors. I would probably talk to several historians and posit them this situation. Let's just say, like, if Napoleon were to invade colonial America, what would happen? What form would this battle likely take? Because this is essentially what's called speculative fiction, where you just kind of write history as if you were in the heads of these world leaders. And so that's probably what I would have done, is basically filmed the documentary talking about these experts kind of getting together and having a powwow and talking about likely strategies that these two would have employed, the forces they would bring to bear. I would talk about the weapons as well and the suitability of those weapons given the type of combat they specialized in. And also, the battleground they would likely choose. It would have been really boring. Here, they have to find some really interesting way to talk about this. So they go, well, let's talk about their really famous battles and talk about, the Washington's great victory against Lord Cornwallis and the Napoleon's crushing defeat of the Russians. And so they bring up what's called the touch table, and they're really trying to sell this touch table. They're literally trying to sell it to you, because every time they say the word touch table, they bring up the icon of touch table, a little URL beneath it probably. And so they have this thing where they go to Google Earth and they zoom in all dramatically onto the field, and they have this little simulation, and they have the armies kind of butting heads, and the guy's drawn arrows, and he goes, this is where Lord Cornwallis holed up, and this is where the French blockaded Chesapeake Bay and prevented Cornwallis from getting his reinforcements. Like, this is really interesting. We're actually talking about real historical, battles, why they were won, and how they were won. And we're actually doing it in a very visual fashion, so they've actually taken this very dry material ordinarily and made it interesting to watch, which stunned me. because they were actually starting to talk about the type of warfare that each side was engaged in, Napoleon and the size of their armies, which is a huge factor when you're talking about Napoleon, who had hundreds of thousands of motherfuckers. He had like 500,000 dudes, whereas Washington did not have 500,000 dudes. He was leading loosely organized militia and a much smaller army, but he was doing them for very different things. He was essentially leading hybrid warfare. He was basically fighting a guerrilla war against the much more regimented British. So he would essentially harry supply lines. He would attack, outliers. He would attack scouts and patrols and stuff like that, and very rarely engage in direct combat. And ironically enough, pretty much every time he did, he lost. Which says, so we're talking vastly different types of warfare, we're talking vastly different types of leadership, and the times when he would, each side would commit their forces to a fight. And which general is better, it's really not as simple as even how they quantify it in the show for the simulation, the X factors, because the fighting was so different. The circumstances completely different. The enemies they were fighting fought differently. Napoleon, French, Russians, Prussians, he fought basically everyone on their fucking sun, the Spanish. There was a guy Napoleon didn't fucking fight. But they were actually managing to talk about the different circumstances and the strengths that each general brought to the table, whereas Washington was a very ingenious, improvisational guy who mainly made himself a pest, and basically and here's Washington. His objectives were not the same as Napoleon's during the Revolution, and Napoleon was out to basically conquer, okay? Washington and, every one of the armies for the colonials, that was not their goal. It wasn't even an option, You're dealing with much more limited resources, much fewer guys. They were really trying to, at best, provoke kind of a stalemate, or at least they were trying to stretch out the conflict for as long as possible because they knew the British were not interested in a prolonged conflict. They couldn't afford it. They couldn't afford to keep sending guys for probably what was already a very unpopular war. So really, for the Americans, it was just kind of about going the distance, about making it as costly and as frustrating a prolonged war as one could get. They weren't really in this to win, so much as in this to get the British to just kind of give up, if that makes sense. So dominance was not an option here. Now the French, Napoleon's forces, they were out to fucking steamroll you. That was, he basically took over and declared himself emperor for life. And he was dealing with a much larger force of guys, and so he was essentially a fucking a sledgehammer that he would use to pound you into submission. Now he had, that's not to say he didn't have any kind of style. That's not to say he didn't have any kind of leadership or generalship. He did, and that was actually very well illustrated when they were talking about this really famous battle where he essentially lured the Russians into a false sense of security and lured them into an ambush, which actually kind of painted him as being kind of a treacherous, sneaky little shit. But hey, he's French, so I'm kidding. So then they start talking about the X factors for each general. I think they talked about they rated them on a scale of 1 to 100. And then they would program them. And they said that we're taking into account all sorts of stuff. We're taking into account intimidation, ingenuity, what else? I forget the abilities. They said tactics, endurance, like aggression. What else? Anyway, very long story, slightly less long. They start rating them, and so what's funny was they basically were very even, and so they were like both around the 70s pretty much all the time for everything. And Napoleon was of course like a better general, but then they were like endurance. No. Well, Washington, he had Valley Forge, and he had sick troops, and the French didn't have to deal with that. So Washington's his endurance is 4 points higher. He's a 76, and Napoleon's a 72. So basically, what you're telling me is they're pulling these numbers right out of their ass. This simulation, even though it takes into account more factors, it's still, when you get down to it, kind of arbitrary. I really don't like this idea of a simulation, because you could tell me anything. I don't know what this thing does. You got these numbers programmed in, and I don't know what the formulas are. I don't really care, but I kind of do. You basically threw this data in a computer and hit the button. You let it churn for a half hour, and then it gave you an answer. How? I don't know. What was really funny was how they were kind of evaluating their various attributes, the ruthlessness, endurance, generalship, and what was... They started talking about Napoleon, and so they go to Napoleon, and they go, Napoleon his ruthlessness was unparalleled. Everyone was afraid of this motherfucker. And they go, why? Well, for instance, he was willing to make any sacrifice. He would throw away, to accomplish his objective, he would consider anyone expendable. He would throw people away like nothing, but he would win. He would win, damn it. Like when he invaded Russia. Now, again, I'm probably really embarrassing myself. Already I admit, my grasp on history is not the best. My memory's not that good. I've already forgotten the name of that really famous battle Napoleon fought. I've already forgotten pretty much everything. Some things I know. I know Napoleon was exiled to Elba and then escaped and led another, revolution. But I don't remember the name of these fights. But one thing I do remember is that when Napoleon invaded Russia, he led 500,000 troops in there, and they pretty much all fucking died, because as ruthless and as willing to make sacrifice as Napoleon was, and he did, he lost. He was forced into retreat with like 20,000 guys, something like that, out of the 500,000. His ruthlessness was pretty much shown up as a joke compared to the Russians, who show you what the meaning of loss is. Those Russians are fucking crazy. They have consistently shown, in pretty much every prolonged conflict they've been in, they will choke you with the bones of their dead in order to at least make... If you're going to beat the Russians, you will have to crawl over every single one of their dead bodies, as illustrated in places like Stalingrad, World War II. Every time the Russians have been invaded, that's pretty much what happened to the Russians when Napoleon invaded. That's what they call, slash and burn? They basically threw everything they had against them in a constant fighting retreat, destroying and pillaging their own land as they retreated, to make sure that Napoleon might have taken the ground, but he was going to starve and die for every step of Russian land he took. And he did. So they were talking... Basically what I'm saying is, they were playing up Napoleon's attack of Russia as if it was a really good thing. They're like, we saw how ruthless and stubborn he was in a fight when he invaded Russia. And I'm like, well, yeah, we saw he was stubborn. We saw he was pretty ruthless. Not all that smart in that case, though. In fact, we kind of saw he was pretty impatient. He attacked Russia in winter. How'd that work out for you, Napoleon? Not really, not really. And again, what's even funnier is they bring this up later on as they're talking about why Napoleon's why his generalship value is like only 76 when he's widely regarded as one of the greatest generals of all time. They're like, well, why is his rating so low? And the guy programming goes, well, he did invade Russia in winter. And they go, oh yeah, that was dumb. But I do, for as much as I shit on this show, and for as much as this discussion, I don't think factored into the decision at all as to who was better, they did at least bring up all of these factors. They did at least talk about the type of warfare, the type of skirmishes. You know, Washington was very much into skirmish warfare. You know, hit and run, guerrilla tactics. How Napoleon won his wars. Napoleon essentially was a very big fan of artillery barrages, a very big fan of cavalry charges. You know, he would ride over you. That's how he would win fights. You know, a concentrated cavalry charge was not something that was really popular until, I would guess, until he really made it famous. So, for a guy like me who's not all that historically minded, who has probably I have embarrassed myself, more likely than not, with my lack of historical knowledge. I'm sure that, you know, Benzai would be, being French, is much more knowledgeable about, you know, French. You know, this is probably, I know they taught this in school. You know, he probably paid much more attention to this in school than I did, about famous battles of the French Revolution, you know, stuff like that. He probably, like, you idiot, what the fuck is wrong with you, man? And, like, you know, Americans, we don't pay attention in history class. We like Washington, what was that, like 1600s? I don't know. But if nothing else, this show at least brought up and threw some facts at you. Like, you know, they actually raised very interesting discussions as to why these battles were fought and how they were won, the various strengths and weaknesses of these guys, and probably, you know, at least have kind of inspired me to go look this stuff up myself, because I'm interested now. I kind of want to know the various strengths and weaknesses of these various generals, and how the Americans fought in the American Revolution, as, you know, the various tactics the French used. So, if nothing else, they at least brought up this topic in terms of what strengths these generals might have had over the other. Now, the numerical values, who gives a fuck? You know, who was better? That's, of course, debatable. But at least they raised the debate in an intelligent, scholarly way, or at least more scholarly than they're used to, in terms of having Dr. Dorian point at a fucking, you know, leg of lamb and go, that guy's dead. You see what I'm saying here? So, it is a little better in that there's slightly more educational content to be found. It's only near the end, but it's there. Now, I guess I should close with my thoughts on the simulation at the end, which is always my favorite part. Always the best part. Which is, of course, the only part that's ever put on YouTube, is the very part at the end, because this is so well done. This part was actually not that well done. I was disappointed with the with how this simulation came out. It just wasn't as well shot. And here's how it goes down. They go, to simulate the battle between these two great generals, we're going to have a 5-on-5 competition. Napoleon and 4 of his Legion of the La Grande Armée, or whatever, versus Washington and 4 of his militia guys. And so, already, you can see we got a big problem here. I actually thought, ignorant, naive as they are, I actually thought they were going to, like, program an army-on-army fight. No. We have a 5-on-5. Napoleon and 4 guys versus Washington and 4 guys. So, of course, we have the Emperor of France bopping around in America with 4 guys and a cannon. They are toting, these 4 motherfuckers are toting a cannon. And so Napoleon, he and his 4, he's riding around. These guys are fucking like, oh, this cannon's fucking heavy. And he's like, silence! And he's like, look! He pulls out his telescope and he sees Washington down there, and he's like, merde! And he's like, to it merde! And there's so I don't even know what I just said there. He points out these guys and he goes, attaque! And they set up their cannon, and Washington sees this, he's like, what the fuck? Get those guys! And so there's 4 guys, they start setting up their cannons, they start shooting their muskets, and people are dropping. They start, like, each side has 1 cannon. They start shooting their 1 cannon at each other, and so people are dying. They reload the fucking cannon, and they fire it again, and people die, and so they, basically it comes down to 1-on-1. Like, these guys, the cannons and the rifle fire kill the other 4 guys, and so Napoleon looks down at the ridge and kind of nods. He mounts his horse, and Washington, and he looks over and he's like, you dead. And he mounts his horse, and Napoleon draws his saber, and Washington draws his sword, and they get into a horse fight, and the horse fight is actually over really quickly. Like, Napoleon swings his saber, knocks him off the horse. I was like, it kind of was over quickly. And so Washington hops up, and Napoleon, for no reason, gets off his horse. He's like, Pona! And he gets off his horse, and he draws a sword, and they have a sword fight. And the sword fight was actually not that well shot. It was, I've actually seen Deadliest warrior fights that were much better filmed. This one was filmed almost entirely in close-up, where you couldn't really see them cross swords. It was almost, honestly, it was filmed a lot like Suburban Nights, where it was all very close, and we were just kind of going like, and you couldn't, there wasn't a lot of fight choreography here. It was, like I said, the fight choreography was really disappointing, and then eventually Washington stabs him in the throat, and Napoleon, he grabs his throat and blood's spurting out. He's like, Josephine, mon amour! He falls down. And Washington wipes his sword off. He's like, I'm a fucking badass. And then he turns around and leaves. I just love that. For all we talked about, actually the simulation probably did take this into account. I don't know. But for all we talked about, weather conditions, relative army sizes, the versatility of the cannons they used, the fighting tactics they used. For all that, it came down to a 5-on-5 straight up fight. You know, who's better, the French or the Americans, in a 5-on-5? And then they just kind of duked it out with 1 cannon. It was ridiculous. Like, again, this is a problem that's endemic to the show, because you've got this idea for a show where you're taking it's ridiculous from the beginning. You've got these two, you're putting 2 stupid historical figures together and having them fight. So already you've got this. I imagine why. Here was the best part to me. Was Napoleon? He's looking down. He sees Washington, and he's like, bastard, and he starts riding his guys. He sends his guys down the hill to load their cannon. I imagine Washington looking up at the charging French and going, wait a minute, aren't we supposed to be allies in this war? Napoleon's fucking riding down, and Washington's like, hey, wait. We're fighting. I'm not British. And no, he doesn't say that. That would have been really funny if Washington was like, what the fuck is that French asshole doing? We're on the same side. You know, there's, of course, budget limitations. You've got this ridiculous concept, and so how do you really film this? You've got this idea based around filming a fight. Of course, you can't have a fight between you at least you can't make it concise in any reasonable amount of time, but the French Legion fighting the Revolutionary Army of America. You can't film this. So, of course, this is a problem inherent to the show. So you've got to make it a 5-on-5. I don't know what you do. It's the same problem when you had Vlad the Impaler fighting fucking Sun Tzu. What the fuck? I have rambled on quite a bit and probably exposed my complete lack of scientific and historical knowledge. But if nothing else, I hope I've encouraged you to research this on your own and become smarter than the Deadliest Warrior guys, because for as shocking as my lack of knowledge is, it's still better than these guys. And that's sad. Next week is Joan of Arc versus William the Conqueror. That should be something to see. I've heard rumored. I have no way of verifying this. No way of verifying. I could probably check online. I just don't care. That the episode after that, or an episode coming very soon, is vampires versus zombies. If that's the case, this show has essentially become exactly what I always made Deadliest character out to be. It has become Deadliest character, which is awesome. If they actually do vampires versus zombies, first off, that's dumb. Vampires versus zombies, you gotta go vampires versus... Who would you put vampires? Zombies, I don't know. I don't like that one. I don't like vampires versus zombies. You gotta go vampires versus... This is a good one. Vampires, who would I put vampires up against? Shaolin monks. No. We gotta go fictional here. Vampires against Robin Hood's merry men. We're getting closer. I like this. I like where this is going. Vampires against the Expendables. No, that would be kind of fun. What's a group of guys? Like vampires. What's a race of guys like vampires that we could go up against? I'm sorry I'm dragging this out, but we gotta... I could come up with something better. Vampires... Well, we can just go generic. Vampires versus robots. I know. Here, no, this is a good one. Vampires versus Terminators. Yeah. I think Terminators would win that, because you can't suck the blood out of it. Yeah, that might be too lopsided. Getting closer, though. Obviously. What am I thinking? Vampires versus werewolves. God. How long did... That took me way too long to come up with that one. It's obvious. Vampires versus werewolves. Shit. But yeah, this show is getting to the point where, really, it's come full circle. It's come to be what I always envisioned it should be. Where if you're gonna be this ridiculous, if you're gonna be this fast and loose with science and history and any kind of tactics, like, you know, if I was making this show, like, okay, again, my grasp of history, as we've seen, not that good. But if I was making a show based on this, I'd fucking research it. I'd fucking find out. And if I couldn't in time, I'd hire a guy who did. I would at least put the focus on getting this done right, which is kind of where I'm coming with Deadliest character. I know a lot of people were actually kind of mad with Megazord versus Mechagodzilla. They said, like, it's bullshit. They cheated. That's the point. I made it specifically to be as bullshit as Deadliest Warrior. That's maybe what I think some of you guys don't get, is that's the reason I did it, was because it's so arguable. You know, these guys fought with completely different circumstances. The height differential alone between these two, I just kind of glossed that over. Of course, it's completely ridiculous. You know, both sides could make really great arguments one side or the other, and I think instead of choosing a winner, you could just have a really good argument about it and leave it up in the air, or at least leave it to like a fan vote or something like that. But to have the balls to make a simulation and go, empirically I think we've shown that Washington is better. Empirically I think we've shown that the Megazord, yeah, he would have won. You know, there's just so many different factors and so many different contexts in which these guys could conceivably mix it up. It's the whole notion is it's a fantasy battle. So the whole premise is that it's a fantasy. It's impossible to know, or impossible even to get a really good guess. Unless the fight is completely lopsided, it's that kind of stormtroopers versus cavemen type argument. I don't know, that'd be a good one too. I guess we did see stormtroopers versus cavemen play out when they fought the fucking Ewoks. The Ewoks won, man. They won pretty cold. That wasn't even really that close. There wasn't even that many Ewoks. Wow. Yeah, I think we just settled that one. Thank you, George Lucas. Okay. But Deadliest character. Every time I talk about Deadliest Warrior, the next episode of Deadliest character comes up. I have no plans yet. I know I announced Borg versus Daleks. That was kind of a joke. I do have an idea in mind for Borg versus Daleks. Because I know pretty much everyone's coming down on the side of the Daleks on that one, but I do have some experts that could talk intelligently about both sides, and I think the winner may surprise you. And as we've seen, here's the thing: people said I was coming into the last one biased. Or people said I'm coming into this one biased, like talking up the Borg, saying like, "Oh, you've got your mind made up for the Borg." You know what? Seriously, for Megazord versus Mechagodzilla. Mechagodzilla would wipe the floor with the Megazord, just in terms of sheer weight and height differential alone. But you notice I went the other way, so I am not above overcoming my bias for the sake of comedy. So if I honestly somebody came forward and offered to animate it for me, and I actually I think I kind of blew them off, or at least I said I can't talk about it right now. I was really busy with other projects. Like I had like PAX E3 and shit like that. I was like, I can't talk about it now. We'll talk about it later. And I think I just never got back to that guy. So it is something I would like to come back to. I know that Screw Attack's Death Battle came out and kind of made that kind of a touchy subject. Not really with me, although if Death Battle is doing well, I don't want to step on their toes. That was just something that kind of came up where we both had the same idea at the same time, and it's up to you guys whether you like one or the other or what you want to think. That's one way or the other. I'm not feeling the same kind of passion I did for Deadliest character as I did before, especially now with Death Battle coming out. I don't even know if Death Battle's still out. I don't follow Screw Attack all that much. It's probably pretty good. Yeah, if I would be interested in going back to that someday. If the animator I got for the last one was really, really good. He kind of, it was pretty well perfect, the fight that he laid out. It took a long time, but that time and effort was worth it. And I think if you watch Deadliest Character Episode 1, it really shines through. That was a great animation that he put forward. If anything, I wish it was longer. It would have been a lot more work, but I could have watched that for 20 minutes. That kind of fighting. But if there's any animators out there who are willing to maybe help out and put that kind of work in, if you see Deadliest Character Episode 1 and you think like, I could do something like that, I'd love to hear from you. I'm not sure I can offer much in the way of compensation. I mean, I can offer credits and stuff like that. We could talk about compensation later. If you have an interest, you have an idea, and you have something you'd like to show me, I'd love to look at it. Because that's a show that could really be something special, or at least be kind of a worthy parody of a show that's already kind of a parody of itself. There's some wheels in that idea, and if I saw a really good idea that inspired me, I think that could actually go somewhere. I'd like to see that. I think really what holds me back from Deadliest Characters, I don't want to edit it. I spend a lot of my time editing reviews, and so the concept of editing yet another side project would push back my review schedule, and that's something I'm actually trying to take a little more seriously now. So to do Deadliest Character is one of those side projects that would really put my schedule in a lot of jeopardy, and I don't know if I want to do that. But if somebody out there has an idea that would really inspire me and is kind of a really skilled animator that could do something comparable to the Deadliest Character thing that was done before, yeah, I'd be interested in seeing that, because honestly that takes a lot of the work out of my hands. Being able to animate that is really awesome. So yeah, I'd love to see that, and we could talk about compensation and something else later on. But yeah, if you've got that idea, love to hear from you. Anyway, I have rambled on a great deal and probably repeated myself a number of times. I don't know who's watching this. This has probably gone on longer than the Deadliest Warrior show itself. But I'm glad you guys love hearing from me. I love bitching. You can tell I love bitching about this. I could bitch about this endlessly, and I have. So I'm stalling. I don't want to keep going on. You guys have fun. I'm glad you enjoyed Final Fantasy X-2 Part 2. I'm gonna see you next, probably at Con Bravo. So for all you guys in Canada, I'll see you then.